Good morning, and thank you for joining us. We're going to spend some time today talking about the top E-2 visa questions when dealing with risky E-2 visa cases. A few things before we get started. Some of you may know that the firm was founded on an E-2 visa 10 years ago. Our founder, Ian Scott, is here personally on an E-2 visa and knows what you're going through. This firm is also a full-service immigration firm, but focuses primarily on E-2 visas. We've processed hundreds of them, and we typically process E-2 visas that are higher risk, meaning lower investment amounts. We have processed at consulates around the world, but our primary two consulates are Toronto and London. We will continue our webinar series, doing at least 2 webinars a month on different topics. And at the end of this webinar, we'll send out a few things. So one is a PowerPoint that's going to cover some of the same topics we'll be discussing today. Another is the E-2 Visa Comprehensive Guide, and also a link to where you can sign up for additional webinars. So for our panelists today, we're very lucky to have Michaela Vrazdova, who's an associate at Scott Legal and has extensive experience processing E-2 visas. My name is Kelly Weiner, and I'm the managing attorney at the firm, and will also be speaking later in the presentation. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please send them through the chat box, and if they're relevant to what we're talking about, we may address them, or if not, we'll save some time at the end of the presentation for questions. And finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on demand. So without further delay, I'm going to kind of get started by asking Michaela if she can discuss who can apply for an E-2 visa.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Nationals of E-2 visa treaty countries can apply for an E-2 visa. Unfortunately, not all countries in the world are E-2 visa treaty countries, but occasionally countries are added to the E-2 visa list. So countries such as, for example, Canada, Mexico, UK, Japan, Taiwan, Chile are all E-2 visa treaty countries, and many, many others. I would just emphasize here that what is important is the country of nationality and not the country of birth. So, for example, if you were born in, for example, India or China, that are not E-2 visa treaty countries, but you later acquired additional nationality, you could still apply for an E-2 visa with the new passport.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So now that we know who can apply, could you tell us a bit about kind of what is the E-2 visa and what are the basic requirements?
Yes, so E-2 visa is a non-immigrant visa that allows nationals of certain countries to come to the US and manage their business in which they invested money. And I'll go over the requirements, but basically there are 2 options how you could qualify for an E-2 visa. So you could either buy an already existing company or a franchise, or if you want to start your own company, you can set up your own company and invest money into that new company. So the requirements are, as I already mentioned, that first you must be a national of E-2 visa treaty country. The second requirement is that you must own at least 50% in the E-2 company at all times. So this is the requirement at the time you are submitting the E-2 application, but you always need to keep at least 50%. If at any point your ownership would drop below 50%, you would no longer qualify for the E-2 visa. Then the third requirement is that you must make an investment in the US, because it's clear from the name that it's investor visa. And so what does making the investment mean? So it's not sufficient if you just kind of like transfer money onto the E-2 company's bank account. you must actually spend the money before you apply for the E-2 visa. So what the government wants to see that is that you are committed to the business, you invested substantial amount of money in the US, and you are serious about the business, and you plan to come to the US and manage that business. So we could include some portion of the working capital the E-2 company has on its bank account, but the vast majority of the money would have to be spent before we submit the E-2 application to the consulate. Regarding the source of the money, so the money you will be investing in the US can come basically from any legitimate source. So it can come, for example, from your personal savings from employment. If you inherited money, it can come from the inheritance. If someone is gifting you the money, it can come from a gift. The money can also come from a loan. So the source can really be kind of any legitimate source. What the government wants to see that the money was not obtained from illegal or criminal activity. So that's kind of like the main requirement here. And then the investment, the money will be investing, the investment must be substantial. So there is no kind of like minimum amount set in the E-2 visa regulations. But the government wants to see that you are the investment you are making is substantial. And this means that they want to see that kind of like anything you needed to buy for the business to kind of start running was invested. And we'll go over this a bit in more detail a bit later. But yeah, the government just wants to see that everything you kind of like needed to purchase was purchased. And in case you are buying an already existing business, the government just wants to see that you paid the fair purchase price for the business. The next E-2 visa requirement is that the E-2 company cannot be marginal. And so what this means is that the E-2 company must have either present or future capacity to employ US employees. So it is not required that you already have employees at the time you are applying for the E-2 visa, but it's definitely helpful if you do. But the government wants to see that in the next 3 to 5 years, you will be able to show that you'll be able to employ at least 3 full-time employees. And this is very important because this comes up at the renewal point. So let's say that you were originally granted the E-2 visa for 5 years, and you didn't end up hiring any employees in the US. Then at the point you will want to renew the E-2 visa, this would be a big issue, and the government would most likely not renew the E-2 visa because you didn't meet the marginality requirement. The next requirement is that the E-2 company must be real and operating. So the government wants to see that the company is not just a dormant company. They want to see that either if the company is already kind of taking revenue from clients, they'll want to see bank statements showing that the company is taking revenue, or you could show, for example, invoices you are issuing to the clients. If the company is not taking revenue yet, you could submit other evidence showing that kind of like everything is ready for the companies to start operating as soon as you get the E-2 visa. So we could submit things such as evidence that you set up a website, you have everything set up, you got all necessary licenses, permits, everything is ready, and the moment you come to the US on the E-2 visa, the company can start either selling things to the clients or start providing services to the clients. The next requirement is that the E-2 investor must develop and direct the E-2 company. So what this means is that the government wants to see that you, as the E-2 investor, will have active role in kind of like managing the E-2 company. So if your goal is to kind of just come to the US and just kind of retire here or not work for the E-2 company, that would not really work with the E-2 visa. For the E-2 visa, we have to show that you will have some sort of like executive or managerial role in the E-2 company. And then the last requirement is that you must have intent to return to your home country when the E-2 visa expires. This is usually, for this requirement, we usually submit just kind of like a signed declaration of the E-2 investor that says that once the E-2 visa expires, the investor will return to the home country. Usually the government doesn't want to see kind of a lot of evidence like they do for B touristic visa. So usually in most cases, the signed declaration would be sufficient.
Perfect. Thank you for that comprehensive overview. So now we know who can apply, we know what you need to do, and how long will an E-2 visa last for? If you go through this whole process, you submit your documents, how long can you get the visa granted for?
Yeah, so this will depend on your country of nationality. Each country has kind of like a different visa period. So for example, nationals of Canada, UK, Italy, and many other countries can get the E-2 visa issued for 5 years. But there are countries that issue the visa only for 3 months or 6 months or 1 year. Yeah, you would just want to check what period is kind of applicable to your country of nationality. I will say that regardless of the E-2 visa validity period, everyone who comes to the US and enters on the E-2 visa will get 2 years in E-2 status. So let's say even if you only get the E-2 visa issued for 1 year, but you enter the US on the E-2 visa, you would be admitted for 2 years. So yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. So could you go a little bit more into detail on kind of how that would work functionally? Like, let's say you're, someone from Bangladesh, you have a 3-month visa, single entry, you enter, you get 2 years in E-2 status and kind of, what happens if you need to travel? Like what are your options at that point?
Yeah, so you can travel in and out during the 3-month kind of visa validity period, but once the E-2 visa expires and you want to travel outside and then you want to come back on the E-2 visa, you would have to go back to the consulate and apply for a new visa. But if you just want to enter the US once and you don't need to travel, then you could stay in the US for up to 2 years.
Perfect. Thank you. So let's go back to the investment criteria, because this is one we get lots of questions about. And I think people always want kind of a number. So maybe could you talk a little bit about how do we decide how much investment is sufficient for an E-2 visa application?
Yeah. So as I said, for the E-2 visa, we would need to show that you invested substantial amount of money in the E-2 company. And unfortunately, there is kind of like no set minimum amount in the regulations. What is substantial will depend on the type of business you are starting. So let's say that you are starting a consulting business. The investment amount could be on the lower side. So I would say for consulting companies, we could submit an E-2 visa application where the investment amount would be like $35,000–$40,000 spent, because to start a consulting company, you don't need to make too many kind of like upfront expenditures. So you can rent an office, you can buy computer equipment, office equipment, you can hire employee. And we could include all of that to the E2 investment amount. But I will say that we have submitted consulting business E2 visa applications where the investment amount was around 40,000 and they were approved. Now, let's say that you are starting, for example, some sort of like a factory or like a manufacturing company, then the investment amount would have to be much higher, because the government wants to see that you kind of invested everything that was needed to start the company. So for the manufacturing company, we would need to show that you purchased all the equipment, all the machines, probably the rent would be much higher for such a big space. So for that type of business, the investment amount would be much, much higher. So how the government kind of like considers like what is substantial is that they use a proportionality test. So they look at how much money you invested in the business, and then they look at how much money is usually kind of needed to start this type of business, and they compare those two amounts, and if they are the same or like very similar, then they would conclude that your investment is substantial. But yeah, the investment amount will kind of depend on the business, but generally what we need to show is that you kind of purchased everything you needed, you spent all money that you needed to spend to get the company up and running. And if we are able to show that, then we would make the argument that the investment is substantial. Now, if you are buying an already existing company, or if you're buying like a franchise from someone else, then the proportionality test would be that the government would look at the money you paid for the business, and then they would look at the fair market value of the company. So usually with the application, we would submit like an evaluation of the company from like an accountant or CPA. And then, the government would again kind of like look at those two amounts. And if they are the same or kind of very similar, then they would most likely conclude that that the investment is substantial for this type of business.
Perfect. Thank you. So kind of a related question, and something that I think comes up a lot is kind of what are some common E2 expenditures, and kind of are all expenditures good? I think that people kind of will come in with different expectations about what was actually needed to start up the business and what would count as a business expense. So could you go over some of that?
Yeah. So I will give some examples, but I would say like generally any expenditures that were, that you needed to pay to get the company up and running and to start the company, like all of those we could include. So for example, the money you paid for website or marketing, we could include any money you paid for like computers, computer equipment, like computers, scanners, printers, we could include all of those. If your company will be selling some goods to people, we could include all the money you paid for the inventory. If you kind of bought any furniture for your office, we could include all of that. Then legal fees, we could include the legal fees you pay to kind of set up the entity in the US, and the immigration kind of related legal fees as well. If you already have employees, then we could include any kind of money you paid to the employees already. Any money you paid for the office premises, for the rent, we could include. Any money you paid for licenses, we could include, like also softwares, advertising, marketing. So yeah, all of these expenditures would be considered like good and strong E2 visa expenditures.
Perfect. And are there any kind of bad expenditures, anything that would be considered bad, or is it always better to just have a higher dollar amount?
Yeah, so I would say like the bad or weak expenditures would generally be those that are, like not really related to kind of getting the company up and running. So if you want to include things like, money you paid for flights or accommodation or Uber or transportation, like those would be weak because it's just hard to make the argument like these expenditures are directly related to starting the business. And then also like any money you paid for like client entertainment. So if you take clients for dinner or, like meals, things like that, like all those would be kind of weak expenditures we would generally not want to include. And one other thing people often ask about is whether they can purchase like a car and include that in the investment amount. So I will say like if your business is, for example, company like Uber and Lyft, like a transportation company, or if you'll be doing like a food delivery, for businesses that you absolutely like need the car to operate the business. In those cases, we could include the car. But if you are starting, I don't know, like a consulting company or a law firm, and you buy a car so you can get to work every day, in those cases, we wouldn't include it. Because again, like in that case, it would be a weak E-2 expenditure.
Perfect. So, so switching gears a little bit, kind of, talking a little bit about some things that can make cases risky. Can you buy a business from a relative? And what are the risk factors if you do choose that route?
Yeah, so I will say like generally we don't recommend it. It's always kind of better if you buy the business from kind of like an unrelated third party. If you do want to buy a business from relative, then we would need to include like an evaluation of the business, just to kind of like make it very clear that even though you are buying the business from relative, you are still paying the kind of fair market price for the business, because that's the main concern of the consulate, is that you are just paying like much less for the business than you would normally do. But generally, I will say that even in cases where we submitted the evaluation and the client kind of like still wanted to go ahead and buy the business from relative, we had cases when the consulate still kind of like didn't like the fact that it was purchased from relative and denied the application. So I will say like we would strongly generally advise against that.
Perfect. So I know we talked a bit about kind of loans and gifts for the source of the investment. I think sometimes people think maybe using a gift could be a way to kind of get around providing supporting documents. So could you talk a little bit about, if you have a loan or if you have a gift, what supporting documents will the consulate want to see?
Yeah, so unfortunately, you will not kind of like get around providing the documents. So if someone is gifting the money to you, the government would want to see, of course, like a gift letter from the person gifting you the money, explaining like where the money comes from. But they would also want to see supporting evidence showing like what's the source of the money. So for example, if someone is gifting you the money and saying that the money comes from their savings from employment, then the government would want to see the donor's tax returns. So you would still need to provide that documentation. And the same is with loan as well. So if someone is loaning you the money, again, we would need to explain where the money is coming from and provide supporting documentation of the person who is loaning you the money. So yeah, we would still need to submit all those documents.
Perfect. So now I think we're going to switch gears a bit, and there's some questions, some of the top questions that have come in. And I think, Michaela, you're going to ask me.
Yes. So Kelly, can you buy like a real estate in the US, and can that qualify as an E-2 investment?
So real estate companies potentially can work for the E-2, but what does not work is purchasing a piece of property, putting it into an LLC, and and saying that's my investment, and I will, that's my my company. I think passive property ownership, or even owning one or two properties and collecting rent from them, is generally considered to be a passive activity that wouldn't qualify for an E-2.
Okay, thank you. Are there any kind of like risky E-2 visa cases or E-2 visa risky areas?
There are. So I think some, a few that we'll kind of talk about today. So, one is consulting, one is real estate, and one is kind of equity trading. And these are three areas that we work with a lot, but they are riskier cases. So kind of for real, I'll talk about kind of real estate and equity together because I think they have a lot of overlap. So for real estate projects, as I mentioned, just purchasing a piece of property, putting it in an LLC, that's not going to be sufficient. Generally, to show that the business is real and operating, to show it's not going to be marginal, you need to show that it's going to be active enough that there'll be activity that will bring in revenue that will support you hiring at least kind of 3 to 5 employees in the United States. So some potential real estate things that we've done that have, cases that have gone well for the E-2 are real estate brokerage firms, real estate property management companies. So if you own, dozens of properties and there's other properties you're going to manage that you don't own, that can be a good, a good way to sometimes incorporate. People often want to incorporate their own real estate that they own. And you can do that, but you need to make it broader than that. You have to have other clients as well. You can also do renovation and construction businesses. House flipping can potentially work, but only on a very large scale. So large scale commercial real estate development where perhaps you are rehabbing, dozens of properties. The people that come to mind were people that owned 30 to 40 homes or owned a few apartment buildings that had hundreds of units in them. So when you're talking about the ownership of real estate being a basis for an E-2, it needs to be on that large scale if you're going to do that. And there has to be an activity attached to it. It cannot just be passive ownership and collecting. Another thing about the real estate that can be risky is licensing. So, depending on kind of what state you're in, there may be different licensing requirements depending on what you're doing in real estate. So you want to make sure you're aware of that and kind of have a plan in place. Sometimes certain state-specific tests you can't pass until you have a social security number. So you may need to have a U.S. business partner or, partner with another local business until you can get that license in place. Another kind of risky area that's similar is kind of equity trading. So similar to real estate, the concern is that the consulate has is, are you just taking your own personal stock portfolio and putting it into an LLC or, or something like that? And that's not going to be sufficient. And similarly, like, are you just, trading for, a few friends or a few family members? Again, if you're going to do that to show it's going to be active, to show it's going to be real and operating, you want to make sure you have outside clients that go beyond your friends and family. You also want to make sure you're going to have enough revenue to support employees and activity to support employees. And then as well, you want to make sure you have the right licenses.
And what about the consulting businesses?
Yeah, so for consulting businesses, and this is a very, very common type of business that we do. Many people do consulting in various areas. And I think the challenge for consulting businesses usually comes up around investing a substantial amount. Many clients come to us and say, I'm the expert. I don't have a laptop. I'm going to work from home. How could I possibly invest, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000? And what we do, we're able to kind of help them, advise them on areas they can spend money. I know, Michaela, you mentioned several of them before. Certain things can help, like, even though maybe you don't need an office space right away, but down the line, you'd have employees. So you may want to get one, or you may want to get one just to have an official business address to receive mail at, rather than having it all go to your personal residence. So you can prepay office rent. That's a very good expense. Perhaps you're going to hire, or you will need to hire employees. So perhaps you hire an employee earlier than you originally planned, and any money you pay to that employee or money you spend to set up your payroll could be included. Any other ancillary employee expenses could be included. If you have to get an accountant, those professional fees can be included. we always recommend you spend money on things that will help you down the line. So perhaps you buy equipment for your employees sooner than you would have initially planned to. Maybe you're going to hire someone at the end of the year, but you purchase the computer when you're applying for the application because that helps you get, a relevant expense into your investment schedule. You can also spend money on marketing. So anything that, related to kind of marketing your services, getting your website set up, all those things are good, good E2 expenses. So moving beyond the challenge of kind of getting the investment amount high enough, I think the other concern for consulting businesses that makes them risky is the consulate is concerned that a consultant's going to come in the US and just be a solo consultant. And that's not what the E2 visa is for. It's not for somebody to be able to come to the US and engage in skilled labor. They need to come to the US and develop and direct a business. So I think that, you always want to have a really strong 5-year business plan that shows what your hiring plans are. And ideally, if you can hire somebody before you file your petition, it can be really advantageous to do so because you're proactively addressing the consulate's concern that you're going to come in and just operate as a solo consultant. And I think, finally, I think the other thing for consultants is just there's many of them. So to be able to show that you actually have clients who are interested in your services. So getting letters of intent, getting signed contracts if you can. If you can't, memorandums of understanding, anything that shows that you have people that are aware of you and are interested in your work and in hiring your company. That's going to be really key, I think, for consulting businesses.
And Kelly, what happens, for example, if someone, had a business plan that they plan to hire 3 to 5 employees, but at the renewal stage, like they only have 1 employee? Like, is there any way how it can be explained, or how can that be addressed at the renewal stage?
So I think if you, I'm sorry, can you say the first part again? I was looking at our question box.
Yeah, like if someone plan to hire like 3 to 5 employees, but then they were not able to hire them, and they only have 1 employee and they want to renew the visa, like can they still do that? Or
I think that it's going to be challenging to get a case renewed with only 1 employee, but there are things you can do. So one is you can kind of look at the history over the last few years. So let's say that the company's only ever had 1 employee, but over the years that employee has changed. They've had, employees come and go, and they've hired, and paid, 3 US employees. We'd focus on that as well. We'd also try to explain kind of what's going on in the industry. So if the person has had active job postings out, and is actively trying to hire and is just having issues because of the US labor market, we'd point to that as well. Additionally, if they had paid any money to independent contractors, we could outline that. And then, we would also just encourage them, if at all possible, to try to hire somebody before filing or before the petition, before you have your interview, even if it's a part-time person. So I think that a lot of times, if the consulate can see that in good faith, you have been trying to get this business to get more employees on board, as opposed to just, oh, I hired someone last minute. I think that oftentimes that can be successful as long as you have a realistic kind of plan to get the staffing numbers up. Yeah.
Okay. And with the kind of like initial E2 visa petition, you mentioned that, it's helpful for the application if the company already has employees, but is that like a requirement, or is it just kind of like helpful to have employee?
Yeah, so it is just, I think it's helpful. It's helpful to have employees. It's specific in the regulations that to show a business isn't marginal, you show that it has to support more than just the investor and their family, or make a strong economic impact within 5 years. So there's not a requirement that you have to have employees before you file. Some consulates kind of take a different approach to this, which is, not necessarily following the law. So depending on where you're filing, you may want to have employees because, you may receive, you may have consular officers who just, kind of decide that that's necessary. But it's not required that you have employees before you file. And the vast majority of our clients do not have employees before they file, but they do have a very strong, realistic business plan that shows how they're going to hire and provides kind of the financial background for how that's going to be realistic. And that's very important, I think, to the ultimate approval of the case.
Okay, thank you. And Kelly, could you go over some common reasons for E-2 visa denials?
Sure. So, so I think, with these types of risky cases we've been talking about, some E-2 visas are denied for a low investment amount. So some investment amounts are just too low. I know we've kind of mentioned some figures today, kind of around the $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 mark for these kind of very small service-based companies where you can make an argument that's 100% of the, the amount to set up the business. I think that, there are some investment amounts that are just too low. We have some clients that have come to us. One comes to mind who spent, $2,000 and put $98,000 in a business bank account. That investment amount is just too low. It's never going to qualify for an E-2 visa. This person came to us. We advised them on how to spend additional funds. I think they spent close to $40,000 or $50,000, and ultimately their case was approved. So a low investment amount can be difficult. If you're in a situation where perhaps you wanted to spend a very low amount, and just try, and then you had more money in your business bank account, the good news is oftentimes you can kind of ultimately get approved by just spending more of that working capital. So a low investment amount, if you have more to spend, can, potentially be one of the easier denial reasons to overcome. Other reasons for denial, one is kind of nature of the business. So, we talked about there are some risky categories where you're going to want to have some, additional strengths to the application. Just going in knowing if I have a real estate business, they're already going to be scrutinizing you a lot more closely. So you want to keep that in mind when you're kind of selecting which business to buy. Also, any business that has a history of not employing many employees. So, for example, there are some business brokers that will often say that, these kind of small, mailboxes, et cetera, and things like that can be good, or, small post office, businesses kind of can be good for the E-2. And that can be the case only if the operation is large enough to have multiple employees. Like if you have a business like that, that's only ever really had a part-time employee and an owner, that's not a really good business for the E-2. Another thing that can happen is just kind of your venue and your filing location. Different consulates, consular officers have a very large amount of discretion in deciding E-2 visa applications. And so, some consulates are more familiar with E-2s, some are less familiar. So where you apply can be, can have an impact. And it's something you should discuss with your immigration attorney, because over the years, consular officers change locations and adjudication trends change even within consulates. Another thing that can come up is kind of concern over whether the business is going to create U.S. jobs. So that's kind of similar to what we talked about with the consulting company issue, which is if you are, if they're concerned that you're just going to come in and you're going to be a solo consultant, they're not going to grant the visa. They really do need to see that you have a strong plan to make this into an enterprise that will create jobs. Other issues that can come up, you may just have an adjudicating officer that either doesn't understand the requirements or perhaps, just is not going to approve the application for whatever reason. As I said, consular officers have a huge amount of discretion over the visa application process. So what you want to do is just try to get as much information as you can about what the officer was unhappy with, because a denial does not prevent you from trying to fix what they were unhappy with and reapplying. So those are some reasons, for E-2 denials that can come up.
Thank you. And Kelly, what happens if someone starts, I don't know, for example, like a restaurant in the US, and later they want to kind of like change the business. So they want to start like a different company in the US or buy a different company. Is that allowed?
So the E-2 visa is company specific. It's granted for a particular company and a particular, activity. So if you had the application submitted for a restaurant, you were approved to run a restaurant. And if you want to kind of dissolve that restaurant and start something completely different, you need to get an approval first. So if you would have the option either to go back to the consulate and submit a new E-2 application. You can also apply from within the United States with USCIS. But the key thing is that if you're going to do a change, you want to talk to your immigration attorney first to determine, is this substantial? So let's say you have one corporation and you're running a restaurant and you want to kind of add a bakery component to your restaurant. that's really not a substantial change, right? Like you're selling food, you're selling the restaurant experience. Now you're just adding another food component, to the restaurant. I think there's a very strong argument that's not a substantial change, and you really wouldn't need to do anything before you made that addition, because it's really an outgrowth, a natural outgrowth of your business. If you have a restaurant, but now you want to dissolve that LLC and start up a new one and start up a new restaurant, you would need to get approval for that first, because the E-2 visa is entity specific. Similarly, let's say you have your restaurant under an LLC and the restaurant closes, you have the same LLC, and now you want to do a consulting business for, consulting for other restaurants. That's pretty different. Like that's a very big change from you were running a restaurant to now you're just going to be consulting on restaurants. I think that's the type of thing where you would need to go back to the consulate. You would need to go back to USCIS first before you do anything, and get that approval before you move forward with the change to your business.
Yeah, I think there is like a common misconception. Like sometimes people think like, oh, it's under like the same LLC, and they see like the company name on the visa, and then they think like if it's under the same LLC, they can do like anything. But yeah, definitely the approval from the consulate would be necessary in some cases.
Exactly. And I think that's exactly right, that there is that misconception sometimes also that just, well, I have a 5-year visa, so even if my company is shut down or is not running, my visa is still valid. It's really not. Once you stop engaging in the activity that allows you to use that visa, your visa is really not valid anymore. And even if you weren't, when you're coming in at the border, even if they didn't ask you questions and let you into the country, if your business isn't operating, technically you are out of status. So you want to just always discuss any changes to the business kind of with your immigration attorney in advance, so that you can plan for any issues that you have, and make sure you don't have any of that time out of status. So I think those are all the questions we have. So we have a couple of questions from the audience. So one is about, can E-2 investors get a license to open a home care agency? So that's going to be, that's basically specific to the state that you're in. You would have to kind of go to them to find out their licensing requirements. And so the other is, can someone purchase a liquor store on a lease for an E-2 visa? Can you use an owner financing option for the inventory? So Michaela, do you want to address this question? Kind of owner financing, where I assume they're saying basically the seller of the business is using the security of the business to kind of allow for financing.
Yeah, so this would not be allowed. I know we said like generally like loans are fine for the E-2, but this is the one exception. So because basically if the seller is giving you the financing, but if the seller is saying that if you are not paying, they can take the business back, that is just not allowed on the E-2 visa. So unfortunately, this is the one exception to the loans where like this would not be allowed.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a key reason why, if you are interested in E-2, it's good to have to hire your immigration attorney kind of before you finalize any purchase sale agreements, because seller financing is very common, but it does not work for the E-2, because the one exception for loans is that if the loan is secured by the assets of the E-2 business, this is not permitted, because then it's not really your personal funds at risk. So that's just something to keep in mind, that, you want to have an immigration attorney specifically look over the contract for immigration compliance before it gets signed. So I don't think we have any more questions. So thank you so much, Michaela, for sharing your knowledge. I hope this was a useful session for everyone, and I hope everybody has a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.